Hi, everyone. So as Jason stated earlier, I'm the collections management librarian here at City Tech and was one of the co-organizers of this event. I'm delighted to welcome some fellow CUNY librarians into this panel. We're going to start with, this session is on film. We're going to start with Jacob Adler's presentation. Jacob is joining us from the Paley Center. Are you still there, Jacob? He's working as a catalog librarian.
That was a while ago. I'm a librarian at Bronx Community College now.
Awesome. So Jacob's presentation, A Sickness Known as Hate, Race, and Identity in the Twilight Zone. Take it away, Jacob.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be giving my presentation today. I hope everybody can see my screen. So yes, I'm happy to give everybody my talk on A Sickness Known as Hate, Race, and Identity in the Twilight Zone, which is of course the famous science fiction and fantasy anthology television show from 1959 to 1964. It's kind of an exemplar of anthology shows that addressed morality and sensitive social and political topics through the lens of science fiction and fantasy. It was very much a product of its time, the 1950s and 1960s, and of socially conscious people like its creator, Rod Serling, who specifically wanted to make this show to have a lens talking about sensitive topics without having to resort to strange tactics to overcome things like censorship and corporate interests that were very controlling influences in television. Now, the quotation I use in my title, A Sickness Known as Hate, comes from one particular episode, I Am the Night, Color Me Black, which is an episode that's about a small Midwestern town shrouded in a sort of supernatural darkness on the morning of a racially motivated execution. Now, this one is the most, I would say, obvious of its kind of race-centered episodes. It uses a physical, tangible representation of darkness as a very obvious metaphor for the intangible but pervasive nature of intolerance and racism. The interesting thing about the episode being that even the supposedly heroic characters, like the town's sheriff and a reverend and a newspaper editor, who can recognize the inherent bigotry and the injustice being perpetrated, are themselves powerless to stop it, either due to their own sort of apathy or because their unwillingness to go against the town's status quo. It's a very apt metaphor for sort of the state of not only the country, but perhaps the social climate at the time. Now, other episodes would examine this sort of topic from a different way. Take, for example, The Encounter, which is about a washed up World War II veteran and a Japanese-American gardener who are both locked together in an attic with a supposedly haunted Japanese sword, and each one has to confront their own prejudices and feelings about each other and about the social climate they find themselves in. Now, the casting was a very important factor in this episode. Neville Brand, who plays the World War II veteran, was an actual World War II veteran who was wounded in battle, I believe, in the Ardennes. And then, of course, there was George Takei, who as a child was imprisoned in the Japanese-American internment camps with his family, and that formed a very crucial experience that he would use to address the plight of Asian Americans and kind of Asian communities in general. Now, this episode actually had some real-world controversy, partially because the episode tried to imply a sort of moral equivalency between both of these characters. The Neville Brand character is sort of demonized for having killed a Japanese officer who had surrendered, and the George Takei character is wrestling with the fact that his father was a traitor and was complicit in the Pearl Harbor bombing. Now, obviously, that last thing was entirely fictitious, and a lot of Asian American groups in real life felt offended by this and protested against this, and that's why this particular episode was pulled from syndication for many, many years. Similar to I Am the Night, Color Me Black, the previous episode, this episode sees both characters as sort of almost aware that they're playing out kind of predetermined roles for themselves in terms of the prejudice itself becoming almost outsized in comparison to their own personal identities. And there's one quotation from the Neville Brand character that I think illustrates sort of the longevity and pervasiveness of this concept, when he says to the Takei character, "In the Pacific, we were told that you guys weren't even human, that you were some species of an ape, and not to worry about burning you out of the caves. Now, all of a sudden, you're fine people, highly cultured," emphasis mine. Now, in talking about race and the Twilight Zone, I would be remiss if I didn't mention The Big Tall Wish, starring Ivan Dixon, which is about an over-the-hill boxer that suffers a devastating loss in the ring, only to find it magically reversed from a wish by his child neighbor, which is then undone when he himself refuses to believe in the possibility of that magical reversal. Now, this episode's notable in a couple of ways, probably most obviously that it featured an almost all-Black cast in 1960 in American television, which was certainly a rarity back then. The more subtle application of the episode, I feel, is in the character's rejection of this magical solution to his problems, just as communities back then did not have some sort of catch-all solution to the social and political ills that plagued them, and so adopt kind of a balance between realism and hopefulness. But the one episode that I think really inspired this particular presentation, and the one I really wanted to talk about, was this episode, The After Hours. Some of you may have seen this one. It's about a young woman who finds herself accidentally locked in a department store after closing hours, and is confronted by the store's mannequins that come to life and surround her, only to find that she herself is also a mannequin and has forgotten this fact after living amongst the outside world for a time. Now, this episode has a lot of subtle things going on with it. The whole notion that someone who is part of this kind of singular, almost culture, if you will, and then leaves it and kind of integrates themselves into a larger majority culture is very reminiscent, I think, of kind of a lot of modern discourse about kind of people passing for different cultures. And, there's the mentions of code switching and things like that. I'm taking something of a postmodern interpretation of it, but there is something to be said about the nature of identity, whether that be racial identity, gender, cultural, whatever, and trying to address that central issue of assimilation. And so the episode becomes kind of a contemplation about personhood and how one person values their own personhood. There's a quotation from near the end of the episode where the Anne Francis character, the main woman, once she realizes who she is, she says, "When you're on the outside, everything seems so normal, as if we were like the others, like the outsiders, like the real people." The tragedy of the episode is that even after reintegrating into where she's supposed to be, this character does not value herself as a person. She only sees herself as one of these mannequins, whereas we, the viewers, can see that they have just as much personhood and, if you will, humanity as anyone else. There's a scene very early in the episode in which she's waiting in this crowded line to get onto an elevator, and then suddenly this other elevator opens up that seems to be plainly visible to everyone and is operated by what we later learn is one of the mannequins. And she's the only one who seems to notice it, and she's the only one that enters this elevator. This is not so much a fantastical thing as it was a stark reality back in, especially in the 1960s, where there's these separate facilities that only some people are allowed to go into, and they are plainly visible, but kind of exist in another world. As the Rod Serling narration at the end of the episode exhorts us, just how normal are we? Just who are the people we nod our hellos to as we pass on the street? This, I think, is the strength of the Twilight Zone. It's not simply presenting a morality tale or presenting something about the world and asking us to sort of internalize it. It's a call to action. It's saying to the viewer, this is the world in which you live in, but what are you going to do about it? I want to close by including another quotation from Mr. Serling, delivered at a lecture he gave at UCLA in 1966, in which he said, "Crime in the streets is one thing, but the prolonged and continuous crime of the denial of freedom is a costly and much more serious departure from justice." Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing everyone else's presentations.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was perfect timing. So next, we're going to have presentation by Kanta, Dihal, and Stephen Cave, who are joining us from the UK, The Whiteness of AI Uprising.
Thank you very much. Let me start my screen share, and let me start by thanking you for having me all the way from the UK. So in this talk, I am presenting joint work with my colleague, Dr. Stephen Cave, but he unfortunately can't make it as it's late afternoon here and he's picking his kids up from school. So this talk is part of our research into the racialization of artificial intelligence as white. And we'll focus on the portrayal of rebellious AI, particularly in the 1982 film Blade Runner, exploring the question of why these machines are portrayed as white when their narratives are based on real-world narratives of slave uprisings. So in Blade Runner, artificial beings are denied rights because of their artificiality. But at the same time, they have all the attributes...
just started just their just.
Sorry, I was interrupted, but I couldn't quite hear what the message was. Can people hear me all right?
Hi, Kanta, this is Jason. Yeah, we can hear you. I think there might have just been a technical glitch, but please continue.
Thank you, Jason. I will continue then with the rights of artificial beings in Blade Runner who have all the attributes that one would associate with a being deserving of human rights, such as linguistic ability, intelligence, autonomy, and sensibility. In fact, the replicants, as they are called, resemble humans so closely that the authorities must use a lengthy test to determine who is human and who is artificial, which is a predicament in which the viewer is also placed. The viewer is also not able to distinguish between human and replicant. And of course, famously, this means that by the end of Blade Runner, the viewer doesn't know whether the protagonist, Rick Deckard himself, is a replicant or not. And yet, when a group of replicants escape the planet on which they were enslaved and flee to Earth, Deckard is hired to kill them all. And Isaiah Lavender puts it, a slave allegory is impossible to miss here, since Deckard is portrayed as a futuristic slave catcher sent to kill escaped androids. So, as soon as this one particular test has determined that a being is not human, a human has the right to destroy it. And the viewer is invited to understand and to empathize with the replicants, even those who are depicted as the antagonists. And the most famous of those empathy-evoking moments is the Tears in Rain soliloquy by replicant Roy Batty as he is dying, having just saved Deckard's life. His humanity is clearly presented in this scene, which combines awareness of his own mortality on the one hand and of his unique experiences on the other hand, which are all memories that distinguish him as an individual and make him one of the most memorable characters of the film. But most notably, what makes the replicants indistinguishable from the humans is not simply that they look human, it's that they look white. Blade Runner is famous for its Hong Kong-inspired aesthetic: neon skyscrapers, crowded noodle bars, texts in Chinese characters. But most notably, this aesthetic extends to the human side characters and the extras. And Richard Dyer, in his excellent book on Whiteness, points out that Blade Runner deliberately uses East Asian extras and minor characters in order to offset the whiteness of its protagonists, including the white androids. He writes, "The yellow human background emphasizes the chief protagonist's whiteness. The whitest of hue are the replicants." And I think the white-haired Roy Batty is a great example of that. So Blade Runner is a fugitive slave narrative set in a future United States. And nonetheless, the film sheds the racial coding of slavery through this whiteness. And this coding is not as strict in the Philip K. Dick novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, on which the film is based, in which Roy Batty is described as having Mongolian features. The parallel between replicants here passing as human with light-skinned people of color passing as white is obvious, as Lavender again points out. Both are considered a threat for blending in, for daring to pretend to be what they are not, and for not being easily identifiable as a threat. The extras and the side characters, and this is specified in the screenplay, they are all non-white. So by being white, the replicants thus pose an explicit threat to the elite among whom they can pass unnoticed. So why then are they portrayed as white, and why does this fit into a wider tradition of portraying intelligent machines as white? This whiteness of AI is the title and subject of a paper that Stephen Cave and I published over the summer, in which we examined 3 possible explanations. I'll mention 2 of these here for time reasons. First, the normalization of whiteness in Western culture, and second, the whiteness of the attributes ascribed to AI. So first, the normalization of whiteness in European and North American societies. And that is the idea that whiteness is so normal in these cultures that many people don't notice that these human-like machines are racialized, but merely see them as conforming to their idea of what human-like means. As Richard Dyer put it, white people create the dominant images of the world and don't quite see that they just create the dominant images of the world in their own image. But of course, this is not a satisfactory explanation in its own right, because not all intelligent humanoid entities imagined by predominantly white industries are portrayed as white. On the previous panel, we heard at length about how Western science fiction has a long tradition of racializing extraterrestrials, aliens, as non-white, especially racializing alien invaders as East Asian. But also in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, which has been criticized for transparent racism, as one critic put it, in its depiction of the alien Jar Jar Binks as a West Indian caricature, and of the slave trader Watto as an anti-Semitic Jewish caricature, with a large nose, skull cap, Yiddish accent, obsession with money. So that suggests that the racialization of artificial intelligence as white is a choice which requires further explanation. So our second explanation is that intelligent machines, such as the replicants in Blade Runner, are predominantly racialized as white because they are deemed to possess attributes that this white racial frame attributes to white people. And we examine those attributes under 3 key headings: intelligence, professionalism, and power. So first, intelligence. The European colonial project legitimized itself through the idea that some races were more mentally able than others, and those deemed less intelligent were considered unqualified to rule themselves and their lands, and it was therefore legitimate, or even a duty, the white man's burden, as Kipling put it, to destroy their cultures and take our territories. And through the 19th century, many efforts were made to empirically demonstrate and measure this intellectual difference, culminating in the development of the SAT in the US and the IQ test. And although explicit associations between racial groups and intelligence eventually declined after the Second World War, they continued to be made, and implicit or unconscious associations between race and intelligence persist widely. So given this centuries-long association of intelligence with the white European race, it's to be expected that when this culture is asked to imagine an intelligent machine, this culture imagines a white machine. Secondly, most of the current discourse around AI focuses on how it is or will soon be capable of professional work. And in this sense, AI is often contrasted with previous waves of automation in which machines performed manual or semi-skilled labor. And of course, the professions, law, medicine, business, etc., are associated with the elite and have a long history of excluding people of color. And third, alongside the narrative that robots will make humans redundant, an equally well-known narrative is that they'll rise up and conquer humanity altogether. So these are narratives about machines becoming superior to humans, stories in which machines become better at every task, or in which they outwit and subjugate those who built them. So when white people imagine being overtaken by superior beings, they don't imagine them resembling peoples whom they have long framed as inferior. Instead, they imagine them as superlatives of themselves, hypermasculine white men like Rutger Hauer as Roy Batty, or hyperfeminine white women like Daryl Hannah as Priz. And the implication of that racialization is that these machines might genuinely be superior, or are at least worthy adversaries. Now, this prevalent whiteness in AI and robotics, in science fiction, and in the real world can contribute to cycles of injustice. Representations normalize expectations of whom AI is for, who creates AI, and what AI is able to do. And this leads to real-world problems, a narrowing of both the potential developer field and of the applications of artificial intelligence, which in turn leads to existing biases and exclusions being perpetuated by the technology. So this is only one analysis of one film to open up this conversation, but needs, of course, much more further research. But we hope that this is a contribution in a small way to dismantling these cycles by drawing attention to the whiteness of these artificial beings and by making strange that whiteness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanta. That was really incredible. We're going to move on now to Sharon Packer, Sinophobia and Tibetophilia, Recurring Racist Memes in Sci-Fi Cinema and Comics. Welcome, Sharon. You're still muted, Sharon.
Okay, is it working now?
Great, good to go.
Can you hear me? The only problem is the screen share is not working. And you know what, if the screen share doesn't work, do you mind if I just read the paper? Let me see if I could do this.
We're seeing your Dropbox screen.
Okay, let's just see what we could do here. I think it just might be easier if I speak.
Sharing the wrong screen.
Yeah. Let me just see what we could do here. I thought I had it set up here. If you give me one moment, and if this doesn't work, then we'll just talk, okay?
Sure, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share. Unfortunately, I have a lot of medical files in my Dropbox, and I have to go through all kinds of passwords, and I don't think we have time for that. But if you don't mind, I do have the screen. I do have it posted somewhere, so you can see a lot of very nice images. At least they're nice to me. So anyhow, thanks for your patience. And let me just mention, the reason I have so many medical files on my Dropbox is because I'm a physician. I'm a psychiatrist and physician in private practice. And I also supervise psychiatry residents. And one of the things I do with supervising them is try to do some soft sell by talking about science fiction images in both cinema and comics. And so unlike the people who've been talking now, I'm not an actual university lecturer, but we still have some interesting information. And also I should mention, I've published several books that are related to this topic, including science fiction film, neuroscience and science fiction film, and superheroes and superegos. And I also have a book on cinema sinister psychiatrists, which mentions some of the psychiatrists we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. But that said, let me talk about the topic, which is recurrent racist memes in science fiction, cinema, and comics, xenophobia and Tibetophilia. Oh, let me explain. Sinophobia is not the same as xenophobia, Xenophobia, which is a more commonly heard term, which refers to fear of strangers. Xenophobia refers specifically to China or Chinese people, which I think is a particularly important topic these days during COVID, which has catalyzed assaults on Asian Americans after it was dubbed the Chinese plague or the Kung flu or flu Manchu. And those of you who know about Fu Manchu will probably recognize his name in that. However, even though Fu Manchu is one of the most prototypical media stereotypes of Asian people, the stereotypes actually predated him by quite a bit. And they're epitomized by the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882, which was recapitulated as the Anti-Immigration Act in 1923, and which was the first immigration restriction that actually focused on race specifically and only. So, and yeah, with that said, let's go on to Fu Manchu and see how these stereotypes play themselves out in media. Fu Manchu, even though we may know about him from the movies, he was actually created by a writer by the name of Sax Rohmer, who started with serialized publications and then novels back in 1912, a long time ago. And how did Mr. Rohmer decide to do this? He didn't do this as a deliberately anti-Asian attempt, but he actually consulted his Ouija board because he wanted to know how to succeed. And the Ouija board spelled Chinaman. And it appears that the Ouija board was quite correct because he sold over 200 million copies of his Fu Manchu books in his lifetime. And since that time, there have been many film adaptations, mostly with Caucasian horror icons. In 1932, we see Boris Karloff starring in The Mask of Fu Manchu. And then we find Christopher Lee playing Fu Manchu in 5 films from 1965 to 1969. Those of you who also watch horror as well as science fiction may recognize these names as being horror icons. And they also each played Frankenstein's monsters in the movies, which tells you about which level Fu Manchu was perceived on. There's some other people who played Fu Manchu later on who were not quite so stereotyped. But I should mention that evil scientists are not uniquely Asian in fiction, but they were the most common movie villain until Psycho's Norman Bates displaced them and the psychotic killer became the prototypical villain. So moving on from 1932 with Boris Karloff, let's take a look at Flash Gordon and Ming the Merciless. Flash Gordon's been in the news again, in fact, yesterday, because the Flash Gordon film from 1980 is being re-released as its 40th anniversary. But Flash Gordon, once again, dates back to 1934, pretty old, from the comic strip when he was created by Alex Raymond. And he's had many media incarnations since that time. Now, one of Flash Gordon's foils is named Ming the Merciless, who hails from planet Mongo, which is a planet that threatened Earth. Planet Mongo actually references the Mongol hordes who were led by Genghis Khan that invaded Europe, and it actually represents this fear of the US being overrun by impoverished immigrants, which of course was recapitulated in the Anti-Immigration Acts. Those of you who might know a little more about Chinese history may recognize Ming as being the name of one of the dynasties in Chinese history. So Ming is a classic villain, and he's played by Caucasian actor Chinese Middleton in 1936, 38, and 1940, and he plays opposite Buster Crabbe. And these serials actually played again on television in the 1950s when the TV became an icon of the American home, and most American homes had TVs by 1954. So many people of the baby boom generation were introduced to Flash Gordon by that means. Then we have a film that came out, which is much flashier than the original Flash Gordon, which is black and white. That film stars Max von Sydow And some of you may recognize that name from The Exorcist, where he played the older priest. Now, here's a little interesting factoid. George Lucas wanted to make Flash Gordon, but he couldn't gain the rights. So he had to make do with a consolation prize, whose name you might recognize, Star Wars. And Star Wars actually tried to simulate the serial aspect of Flash Gordon, if you may recall that. And he used mystic themes and kind of a scroll down with the serials. So George Lucas didn't do so badly for himself, even if he didn't get first choice. So maybe that's a lesson to us all. But anyhow, since I'm talking about serials, I feel compelled to mention another serial, which is not about Chinese people, but actually about a quote unquote Japanazi with Dr. Daka. The Batman serials in 1943 would play before films. And in 1943 may become obvious as a World War II era serial. And Dr. Daka, whose first name is Tito, represents what was called a Japanazi, which was an amalgam between the Japanese and the Nazis. And Tito was the name of the benevolent dictator from the former Yugoslavia. And Dr. Daka does some pretty weird things with Batman and some other things, and putting them in kind of a colander head and taking away their powers. And we see a very similar kind of imagery, which you'll see on the website with my PowerPoint, which didn't show up here tragically. We'll see that in Dr. No in 1962. Now, Dr. No, if we have any James Bond fans here, was the first James Bond film. And once again, even though he's represented as Japanese, I feel obligated to mention this because Sean Connery just died 2 weeks ago. And once again, for those of us of a certain generation, Sean Connery was a dinner table conversation. His name was known everywhere. And he played Dr. No, he played James Bond in most of the James Bond film, or at least the James Bond films that did really well. And once again, Dr. No was played by a Caucasian actor whose name was his name was Joseph Weissman. And the character whom he played was Dr. No, who was an evil genius who had mechanical hands. Now, we could say that this characterization of Japanese people after World War II, quite a bit after World War II, may represent persistent anti-Japanese attitudes post-war, possible guilt projections for bombing Hiroshima. I doubt if we could say it's guilt about the Japanese internment, because that really wasn't a topic of conversation back in 1962. So we do have some other images here, and I'm going to get back to the Chinese representations with Iron Man, another Marvel comic character. Iron Man came about in 1963, a year after Dr. No. And in 1964, we get his arch nemesis appearing. And the arch nemesis is named the Mandarin. And the Mandarin was popular enough to be repeated many times over. The Mandarin has access to Oriental mystical abilities and counters Iron Man's technology. And in that way, it's kind of paradoxical because many of the representations of East Asian people subsequent to World War II show the technological prowess and also the economic prowess, which made Americans very fearful. And the film adaptation of Iron Man 3 stars Ben Kingsley, who himself was a person of British and Indian descent. But unlike a lot of the other characters who played Fu Manchu, Ben Kingsley actually plays heroic characters such as Gandhi and Schindler's List. And by the time the next film comes up, we're going to see people stepping up to the plate and getting a little more culturally sensitive. Because Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is actually finally going to star an Asian actor by the name of Tony Leung Chiu. And in the comic books, it's this character has a father whose name you may recognize, Fu Manchu. But the character was changed because of cultural sensitivity and to avoid the persistent negative stereotyping with Fu Manchu. Now, let me finish with another character, with an Asian actor, Asian American, I should say, named B.D. Wong, who's a rather versatile actor who plays several interesting roles that are relevant to our topic. B.D. Wong appears in Jurassic Park, the Jurassic Park franchise, which went on from 1993 to the present, and he plays the evil scientist, Dr. Henry Wu. But B.D. Wong also plays other roles, like he's a soft-spoken FBI agent and psychiatrist in Law & Order SVU for 14 years, and I personally think he was the best psychiatrist on that show. But he has other films, he has other roles where he doesn't play evil characters. But when he appears as Dr. Hugo Strange in Gotham TV series, he is surely evil. And in Gotham, which is a takeoff of Batman, which appeared from 2016 to 2019, he plays this Dr. Hugo Strange, who's not at all like Dr. Stephen Vincent Strange from the other comic books. But Dr. Hugo Strange performs horrific experiments on inmates of psychiatric asylum, Arkham Asylum. And he does all kinds of genetic manipulations that are reminiscent of the genetic manipulations in Jurassic Park, which were done on dinosaurs, but also remind us of another character from back in the 19th century, Dr. Moreau, who did similar animal and human genetic manipulations back in the 19th century literature with many, many, many film adaptations. So we could see that these are not unique to this time and age. And also with Dr. Hugo Strange, even though he's played by an Asian actor in more recent manifestations, with Gotham, in the comic book, he has such an amorphous looking appearance that he's definitely not Asian, but one might even argue, as considering that we've been talking about artificial intelligence and Twilight Zone, that he's not even human. But he is specifically intended to be human because of what he does. But it is kind of interesting that both of these characters do genetic manipulations, and they also represent, at least at some point, Asian characters. So I don't think we have time to go on to talk about Tibetophilia, but there is Tibetophilia talked about in the slideshow that's on the web. But one of the epitomes of Tibetophilia is Dr. Stephen Vincent Strange, who began as a neurosurgeon, who became disabled and then had to leave his medical practice after getting involved with a lot of shady procedures, and then goes to Tibet and gains mystical skills. And we can go on, but I think I'm probably going to run out of time momentarily because this is a recurrent meme, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions about this later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. So last but not least in this panel, we have Jessica Wagner Webster, who will be presenting race propaganda and sci-fi horror films during World War II. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Wanett. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen here. Okay. Okay, and let's start the slideshow. Okay, so thank you. So I am going to talk about captive wild women, race propaganda, and sci-fi horror films during World War II. Just as an introduction, this lady on your left is an actress named Aquanetta. She starred in several small Hollywood films of the 1940s and 50s. It's a screen grab from her first major motion picture, which is called Captive Wild Woman, in which she plays a female gorilla from Africa who is transformed by a mad scientist into a human woman. And you can see her ape version on the right. Aquanetta, the actress, in fact, was of Native American descent. But she was the only person of color in this movie that touches on otherness and wildness and improving the race through science and these themes that we've been talking about. Captive Wild Woman was one of several sci-fi horror pictures that the US Office of War Information's Bureau of Motion Pictures reviewed for propaganda content during World War II. And it was surprisingly found to be perfectly in keeping with messaging around race and film, despite the fact that to a modern viewer, there's a lot of very problematic content and themes in the depiction. So I'm going to talk a little more about this film at the end. I'm going to give you some context about the Office of War Information and what's going on, and talk about why its suggestions tended to be very confusing and interesting in terms of how it viewed people of color, particularly African Americans. So just for some context, where are we in the early 40s? Jim Crow is still going on, lynchings are still going on. The military remains segregated. It would not be desegregated until after the war and the Truman administration in the US. There is ongoing activism and civil rights activity going on. It has been for many generations by this point, everything from informal organizations on the local level, church organizations, to more national advocacy from the NAACP, unions, and so forth, in order to struggle for voting rights, stopping lynchings, job security, desegregation, all of these themes that we come to be very familiar with as the civil rights struggle goes on. Also, of course, there is strong anti-Japanese sentiment as the US is fighting a war with Japan. The enemy, civilians and government are described very frequently in racialized terms during this era. People are often described as vermin, as swarms. These themes come up very frequently in written and visual depictions of Japanese folks during the war. And it's something the propaganda mission of the US often struggles with. Okay, so what's going on with FDR's government with respect to civil rights stuff? The FDR has some personal sympathies with the civil rights struggle for Black Americans, but he often feels caught, apparently, because he wants to get a lot of his goals passed by maintaining a coalition with the Southern Democrats, who are white supremacist and segregationist, and he doesn't want to alienate that wing of the party. So oftentimes he avoids policies that are overtly integrationist or overtly are in support of Black civil rights. But sometimes he'll have bureaucrats and people who he supports doing things behind the scenes to sort of subtly improve the status of African Americans. But ultimately, his support of Black Americans kind of takes second. He kind of betrays their support in order to support these sort of broader, what he perceives as these broader aims with respect to the New Deal and winning the war. So let's turn to the Office of War Information. It was founded in 1942, about 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It included a Bureau of Motion Pictures, and the job of this bureau was to review films for propaganda messaging, both for American distribution and also international distribution. They viewed that there were key different aspects of its propaganda mission, including how they wanted to portray people of color and also racial disparities, because they wanted to depict African Americans and other people of color. They wanted to avoid depicting them in a very stereotyped way. They were concerned that if they portrayed Black Americans in a sort of subservient way, it would showcase to our enemies and our allies that the US was in fact not as democratic or free or egalitarian as it liked to portray itself, even though of course this wasn't true, right? They just wanted to avoid depicting the accuracy of what was going on, even though a lot of the people in the Bureau of Motion Pictures were in fact fairly progressive, civil rights organizers and people who had this, they were supporters of this mission. They often, in order to avoid angering the Southern Democrats and in absence of clear messaging from FDR, would just avoid any images of stereotypes entirely. Sometimes they would edit out characters altogether who were people of color because it was too problematic the way they were being shown. So it was kind of complicated, and in the end, you don't get a very clear messaging program, especially as regards race, and you get some very confusing suggestions. So now I'll turn a bit to the pictures. So first I'll touch briefly on a couple of pictures. These are all going to be 1943 pictures. Revenge of the Zombies and I Walked with a Zombie are movies that depict African Americans, voodoo, zombies, this kinds of thing. And they are problematic to the OWI because they show African Americans who are participating in these rites as being of lesser intellect. And in fact, they mentioned that in Revenge of the Zombies, one of the problems is the Black characters are portrayed as of like inferior intellect. So a scientist is able, a Nazi scientist is able to make them into zombies because their brains are less strong or things like this. So when things were overt in that way, they were able to flag them, the OWI reviewers, and they were able to say, hey, this is a problem, you need to change it. So in that respect, even though these were fantasy movies, they played into stereotypes that the OWI had a problem with. But when we get to Captive Wild Women, it is not the same. So here are some stills from the movie. So I'll tell you a bit about the plot. So a circus trainer has gone to Africa and kidnapped a bunch of animals for his circus act and brings them back to the US, one of which is a gorilla, a female gorilla, and he's begun to train this gorilla on the trip back. Meanwhile, in the US, we meet a renowned endocrinologist who's a mad scientist, and he wants to do human animal experimentation, perfect the race, these kinds of words. So he kidnaps the gorilla and he gives her hormones and brains from white women who are his research subjects to civilize the ape and turn her into a woman. The result is our character, who you'll see in the bottom, second from left, who he names Paula Dupre. In the film, there's no mention of her race, but she's obviously foregrounded as not white. Nobody talks about her race, and no one treats her differently, but she is kept apart from the other characters. She doesn't talk, and she has a natural ability to help control the animals because, in fact, she is a gorilla, right? And so she's hired by the circus to help the Animal Training Act and the trainer who kidnapped her, with whom she is, of course, fallen in love. So then Paula realizes that the man doesn't feel the same way about her. So she gets angry, and then she starts turning back into a gorilla. The first thing you see, of course, is her skin darkens. That's what's happening in the top picture. And eventually she starts turning back into an ape. And, you know, as I tell this, you're just like, oh my gosh, what's happening? So as an ape, she starts acting more wildly. She attacks the girlfriend of the trainer. And I won't spoil the ending of the movie, but it doesn't end well for Paula. So, you know, obviously a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of really obvious, you know, challenging stereotypes. And so what did I know I'm going over it. The Bureau felt that this is a perfectly all right portrayal, even though they got letters of people who were protesting this. And they said, you know, this will harm the war effort, especially portrayals of Black people. Like, they specified that viewers were clearly concerned with this. The BMP thought it was a harmless fantasy. Yes, you know, of course, it's a circus movie and she does turn from a gorilla to a woman, but it's okay. And they said, quote, probably all of this controversy is caused due to the fact that the woman is reported to be part Negro, which of course has nothing to do with the picture. So they had this weird tunnel vision about this one. And so, you know, I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. I think a lot of it has to do with a few things. The inconsistent messaging of the president, the tightrope he's trying to walk with, supporting some civil rights stuff and messaging around that while not alienating the Southern Democrats. I think that the BMP reviewers had a hard time with sci-fi and horror movies because they kind of come out of a realist narrative where they were much more able in the rest of their files to confront these, if they had really obvious sort of like stereotypes of Black characters, they were able to see those when it comes to a realist picture. But sci-fi fantasy ones, they didn't. I guess I'll stop there because I'm over. But really interesting stuff to figure out sort of what's going on with these propaganda narratives. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was an impactful way to end this film session. We did get some questions here in the Q&A. I guess I'll just start from the top. From Torn Saint, Carol Kipix, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. RUR was perhaps the first sci-fi narrative to present the robot's point of view, even a slave rebellion. More recently, there is an argument from Joanna Bryson that AI's robots should be considered as slaves. Is the question of consciousness the key factor here, whether of racial identity or of selfhood? This question is not directed at any particular person. There was some talk of AI robots from all of you in a small way. So who would like to tackle that first question?
Actually, even though I didn't talk about this, what really distinguishes the androids is their ability to dream, and that was what distinguished them from humans. And finally, the last edition was able to dream, and so that's why she couldn't distinguish herself from humans.
I could also elaborate on this. So to respond to the question about Chapek's RUR, well, this was a play, but I wouldn't say it was a narrative that presented the robot's point of view. It has robot characters, but the protagonists are humans. Two of the human characters. Oh, it just disappeared off the. Oh, here it's answered. So yes, whether it presents the robot's point of view, well, it has monologues by some of the robots, but it does very much lean on an unequal distribution of attention given to human characters. Regarding Joanna Bryson's argument, now it's very important to bear in mind that Joanna Bryson is saying that robots should be considered slaves and not AIs. With robots, she means unintelligent tools, not artificial general intelligence, so a machine that is equally intelligent as a human. Because her argument is, I'm quoting from memory now, but she, as far as I remember, she says that in humanizing robots, we further dehumanize real people. And this ties in with that argument of a tool that is supposed to do things that is associated with a certain kind of person. So by giving rights to robots that are only tools and not intelligent beings, we are denying and erasing the history and current experiences of many kinds of humans.
Thank you so much. Anyone else have anything to add, or shall we move on to another question? So also from Torn, in Blade Runner, the possibility of love and empathy are represented as the markers of full consciousness. The replicants gradually develop such capacities in an evolutionary way. Does invisibilizing race lead to an erasure of the history of imperialism and racial coded domination in the film, underpinned by social Darwinist ideology?
Well, I guess this is a direct question about my talk. I would be happy to move to a different question just to make sure that others get to speak.
Okay, let's perhaps come back to that if we have time after Raven's question. So Raven Gomez asks for Jacob, could you talk a bit more about when you mentioned Rod Serling's political message behind these episodes as, quote, not simply presenting morality, but a call to action, end quote. I'm curious if you found any connection with this non-traditional for the timeline method of narrative storytelling reflected in his pedagogical practices, both as a student and faculty advisor educator at Antioch College and other institutions, or through his time in military service. Was this call to action carried forward outside of the Twilight Zone production? It's a lot to answer there.
Yes, I'll try to be concise. Excellent question. Serling was someone who not only was very socially conscious, but he was very concerned with what he saw as injustice at the time. And I think the biggest injustice he saw was prejudice of any kind. He was nicknamed in a lot of media publications as television's last angry man, because he and sort of his generation of television writers were very concerned with trying to address these head on through the medium of television. And a lot of them kind of fell out of favor with television and abandoned the concept until Serling came along with the idea for Twilight Zone. Some of you may know this already, but part of what motivated the Twilight Zone was that Serling wanted to do a dramatization of the murder of Emmett Till, and he wrote a script, I think, for Playhouse 90. It was called A Town Has Turned to Dust, but it got censored all over the place to the point where it barely resembled what he wanted to talk about in the first place, and really wasn't even about the thing in question. And he, he famously remarked one time with the idea of the Twilight Zone was, I could have Martians say what Democrats and Republicans were too afraid to. So there is that, and all of his activities, I think, surrounding the Twilight Zone were sort of in furtherance of this concept of trying to allow people to see the world in a different way. He did do a lot of lecturing. He did do instruction at Antioch. It didn't quite take at the time. The show that Serling did immediately after Twilight Zone, the one he created after it, was actually a Western. It was called The Loner, and it starred Lloyd Bridges, if I remember correctly. And that only lasted a season because the network said it was too cerebral, because he was using the Western and sort of specifically its post-Civil War period as a way of examining kind of the post-war and current war traumas of America at the time. America is still raging on in Vietnam. Twilight Zone, I think, was one of the first dramatic programs to even mention Vietnam in any capacity. But the public didn't quite take on to it. And the other thing that's important to know about Serling is that he never considered himself to be a science fiction or fantasy writer. And he certainly wasn't known as one before Twilight Zone, and then after he was sort of synonymous with the concept. Ironically enough, Serling's kind of vision of the future, earlier on there were talks about how science fiction is kind of emblematic of the future. His vision of the future was, I think, a lot more accurate than a lot of the sort of standard science fiction writers of the time. Serling predicted that the world would continue to be dominated by mass media and telecommunications, and that it was all going to sort of bring us together and apart in a sense. So that I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but I think that's there's a lot to understand about sort of the worldview that kind of informed Twilight Zone and what it kind of meant going forward.
Thank you, Jacob. I had a question. I mean, I guess a comment on how what you just stated connected with Jessica's presentation about censorship, right? So the Twilight Zone growing out of a heavily censored idea. So Jessica, I thought your presentation was fascinating that, Captive Wild Woman, the exception for that was made in what even then must have seemed starkly racist, So if you wanted to share more about, I particularly was interested in how you came across Captive Wild Woman, and was that the first film that made you seek out other projects like that?
So this research was done for my master's thesis a while ago, and I was doing research on the Office of War Information's files, the Bureau of Motion Pictures, and I was interested in sort of various portrayals of people of color during the war era and what this messaging was about. And so I came across the film in the files, the script review and correspondence about it. And I just was like, I have to see this film. This sounds amazing and crazy. And so I found it. I actually own a copy on VHS, and I watched it because I sort of needed to see what this really was. But it was interesting in sort of the wider context of how they sort of thought about race and talked about race. And it was interesting because, so the Bureau of Motion Pictures wanted to have this sort of progressive messaging around race, but they did it a lot via omission. And they had policies not only around portrayals of African-American folks, but also Asians and Asian American folks I talk about in the film. They had this sort of interesting, and this touches a bit on Sharon's topic, but they had an interesting way of trying to address portrayals of Chinese and Japanese characters, because sort of the US has this long kind of history of really stereotypical portrayals and racism against Chinese folks and Japanese folks. And we are in World War II on the same side as Chinese folks. So they wanted to sort of, they didn't want to have them be as stereotyped in the movies, because if those movies were getting distributed around the world, they didn't want horribly stereotypical portrayals of Chinese folks in these movies that were supposed to be on side with Chinese folks. And so I sort of examine all of that. And the interesting tension too is that, and I didn't really get into this in the presentation for lack of time, but the Bureau doesn't actually have any enforcement power at all. They wanted it to, but it was politically too tenuous because they were viewed as these sort of lefty liberal progressives trying to make changes. And so the ultimate way it was set up was the Bureau's reviews were advisory. There were a lot of people in the Bureau who were connected to Hollywood people. So they sort of corresponded with their friends and colleagues. Wendell Willkie, the former Republican nominee for president, was involved. Walter White from the NAACP was involved. There were all these people who were sort of famous and important that were involved. But a lot of times the studios said no, or they didn't change it. And there was nothing they could do about it, because ultimately the only people who could refuse international distribution for a film were in the Office of Censorship, which was a parallel organization that had control over licenses for distribution through their mail censorship powers. And they were all journalists. So they were just like, as long as it's not betraying war secrets, we'll send it. It's fine. So, wow. So they were sitting there saying like, no, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. And then the Bureau folks were trying to do activism sort of behind the scenes. And so it was this really interesting tension, because it was sort of emblematic of the way civil rights aims were kind of treated more generally during this era.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to you all for your presentations. We're unfortunately out of time to address some of the other questions here, but I was happy to be able to hear from each of you once more, with a little bit more about your topic. But in an effort to stay on schedule, I'll hand it back over to Jason.
Thanks everybody for a really great session. Thanks, Wanett, Jacob, Kanta, and Stephen, who's here in spirit. Sharon and Jessica. It was really good presentation. So thanks again for everybody on that. And one thing you might notice is in the Q&A, there's some unanswered questions. So you should be able to still see those once I switch you all back to attendees. And if you'd like to, you can use the chat feature to respond to some of those if you have time and are willing to do that. So those will still be there. And so what I'll do now is begin setting things up for the student roundtable. Begins at 12. And this is, a brown bag presentation. So if you have something to eat for lunch, please go ahead and break it out. And we're going to hear from Jill Belay and her students, Oscar Abundez, Derek Bardeles, Corey Douglas, Ronald Gordon, and Tommy Sue. And so we'll get started with that in just a little bit as I get things set up. But if anybody has questions, again, you can reach out to us in the chat. And also just to re-up this, I shared this earlier, here are some important links. We got the program, the link to the live stream if you'd like to share it with others, the hashtag CDTechSF, and also for this afternoon's author readings, it's going to be a discussion with the authors, but the authors have already shared with us their readings. So if you'd like to watch some of those, maybe after the symposium, those will be there for folks to see whenever they have time. Okay, so I'll get things set up and we'll get started again in just a little bit. Thanks again.